Hey everyone, it's 1 o'clock here, Eastern Daylight Savings Time. We had that change in time. I don't know if you do daylight savings where you are, but we do it here. So we've been getting up what feels like an hour early every single morning. But it's 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Savings Time here on the East Coast. I'm Paul Merrill. I'm from Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services, and we focus on test automation. If you haven't heard about us, we help companies with three different problems. Number one, we help companies implement DevOps. We help companies sync up dev and testing in agile environments. And we also help automate regression testing. We do that through consulting, helping companies plan and strategize how they're going to approach test automation. We do that through training, whether you need help in things like, hey, BDD or Gherkin, if you need help in robot framework or lots of other things, Selenium, many other courses that we have. We also help companies with dedicated experts. So if you need people to work remotely, embedded in your team to implement test automation, a framework, the scripts, whatever it is you need, we can help out with that. We're based in Cary, North Carolina, and that's right here next to the Research Triangle. And I've been at this for a long time, and several of the people that I've met along the way have been wonderful. One of those people is Andy Knight. And if you don't know Andy Knight, I'm excited for you because it's going to be a wonderful introduction to him and what he does. If you don't know Andy, go look at the automationpanda.com. I'm not sure if he'll clarify that. I believe it's automationpanda.com. And also find him on Twitter. Here's his Twitter handle at automationpanda. So we're going to get into this in just a second. First, I want to make sure that you guys have a little bit of information. Number one, you all have a control panel from GoToWebinar of some kind. It may be a part of your browser, it may be a pop-up native application. You've got a section in there for asking questions, and you can type questions in there. You also have the ability as an attendee to raise your hand. So there's a button you can press to raise your hand if you have a question as we go along. And I'll be asking you just to go ahead and ask questions, go ahead and type them in. I'm going to be kind of handling those and distributing them to Andy as we go along. But to get started, I always like to make sure of a couple things. Number one, you know what's coming up. So I'll be at TriAgile here in Raleigh, North Carolina, just right up the street from me on the 2nd of April. So a couple of weeks away here. I'm hoping that's at least a couple of weeks away because I have to work on my talk. My talk is going to be on refactoring. So if you're in this area, if you're going to TriAgile, or if you want to go to TriAgile after hearing this, join me for my talk on refactoring. A lot of us in testing hear the idea of refactoring. We hear developers talk about it, and we hear the term misused a lot. So what I'm going to do is explain refactoring with several different examples, and I'm going to use human readable language to do refactorings. I'm going to use English language. I'm also going to use robot framework, and I'm hoping also to be able to use Cucumber, something you can use to implement BDD, by the way, to talk about refactoring and go through certain ones of the refactorings. So you don't have to know how to program, you don't have to be a developer. If you're in the area, TriAgile is a wonderful conference. It's an agile conference. Come join us on the 2nd. I believe they're still selling tickets, although this thing sells out almost every year. I think they had over 700 people 2 years ago. I didn't get to go last year, but it is a huge event with wonderful, wonderful speakers. So come see us there. We're also sponsoring it, so that's exciting. In April, we'll do another webinar. Our next one will be with Carlos Kidman. If you don't know Carlos Kidman, you should. Carlos is an up-and-coming speaker. He's up-and-coming in the testing community. He helps manage a couple of different groups out in the Salt Lake City, Utah area. By groups, I mean meetups. And he does a whole lot of really great content out there. I met Carlos, I believe, through just social media somewhere, and got to know him when I was out in Salt Lake City with customers. Wonderful guy. He's going to talk about continuous integration and continuous delivery. And if you've been a part of these webinars, you know that I do a talk on that and that I've done it on these webinars. You can go back to beaufortfairmont.com/webinars and you can go watch the CI/CD session I did before. Carlos is going to start where that one left off. So he's going to get deeper into continuous integration and continuous delivery for that. It's going to be wonderful. He's a great speaker. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Make sure to stay on our mailing list and you'll hear about that and the date for that coming up. A bunch of you know that we give away a $50 Amazon gift card each webinar. Today, we're going to be doing that at the end of the show, at the end of the webinar. So stick around to the end for a chance to win. I'll be picking a name of someone to win. And this is great. I got to tell you, I love having credit in my Amazon account because every once in a while, I need something like a new bag for my cables. So when I travel, I have a bag for my cables. I learned this trick from Mark Tomlinson. Have a bag for your cables, and there are a lot of benefits to it. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that, but it can help a lot. So I found credit on my Amazon account where somebody had given me a gift card. That is nice to have. So stick around to the end for a chance to win that. So now I want to introduce you to Andy. So Andy Knight is an engineer, consultant, and international speaker who loves all things software. He specializes in building robust test automation solutions from the ground up. He currently works at Precision Lender in Cary, North Carolina. Read his tech blog at automationpanda.com and follow him on Twitter at automationpanda. So let me unmute him and bring him into the conversation here. Hey, Andy, are you there?
Hello, thank you, Paul.
Hey, I'm going to change you to the presenter.
Sounds good.
And we're going to get going here.
Cool beans. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here.
All right. Whoa. Okay. Everybody see my screen okay? Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Paul. I'm really excited to be here talking about behavior-driven development. So let's get started, shall we?
Hey, I do not see your screen yet. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, hold on. Why is it not? No,
I'm gonna.
Hold on, not showing.
It says waiting.
Okay.
Now it says now viewing.
Okay.
Oh, you know what? I'm in. I know what it is. I see it. We see it. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting it.
Okay, so we're good. Cool.
Yes, we're good.
Alrighty, whew, great way to get started, right? Let's try again. Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for being here today, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me to give this webinar. Today, I'm going to talk about behavior-driven development, and specifically how we can practice it and how we can practice it well. As Paul said, I am the Automation Panda. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. Here's a fun picture of me from last year's PyCon. I'm a self-professed Pythonista. But I also do a whole bunch of other things as well. Enough about me. Let's talk about what we'll learn today. The main thing I want us to learn through this webinar is what BDD is and is not. I want us to be able to define software products in terms of their behaviors, because we're talking about behavior-driven development. And I also want us to learn some key BDD practices from a pragmatic perspective. Through these practices, I want us to understand the major benefits of what BDD can offer us, rather than just throwing around a bunch of buzzwords. And I also want us to see how BDD can solve a lot of the common development problems we have in software, right? BDD should not be the next buzzword. It shouldn't be the next initiative. It should be something that really brings us value. And that's what I want to focus on today with our talk. So let's start off by looking at some common problems we face within software development. The first major problem that we face, at least that I see fairly frequently, is miscommunication. Here on this slide, we see the infamous project cartoon, in which we have all sorts of different pictures of how people understood products to be. The reason why this is so humorous to us is because it's true to reality, right? When we see how the customer explained it versus how the project leader understood it versus how the programmer wrote it, right? Everybody has a different interpretation of what something should be. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because everybody has a unique perspective. Everybody has their own role, their own experience, and their own needs that they're trying to meet. The problem is when we don't collaborate with that well, and we end up with quite literally a mess. Miscommunication has serious impact as well, because if we're not on the same page together, then we will end up wasting a lot of time. And in software development, time is money and time to market is a loss. So We want to make sure that despite our differences in roles and experience and understanding, that when we talk about the software features that we want to develop and test and ship together, that we are all talking about the same thing and have enough of a mutual understanding to make sure that we'll make the right things happen and deliver the appropriate value. Another common problem we hit in software is poor planning. Most of us work inside of an agile framework, and I'm just going to drop it like it's hot. Planning meetings are brutal. I've been in planning meetings in many places, many teams, and for lack of a better word, they don't always go very well. A lot of times they're long, they're boring, they're unproductive, and the outcome does not justify the time investment we put in. Now, that's not to say you can't have good planning meetings. I'm simply speaking anecdotally from my own experiences. But at the same time, I've shared my thoughts with other people, and a lot of people I've talked to agree with this, right? Typically in planning meetings, that's the time when we come together to look at our stories and try to come up with what the story is, what the acceptance criteria for the story will be, how to size it in terms of points or t-shirt sizes, and then also what we will plan to commit to the sprint. All these activities are good and they're things that we should do, but there are problems a lot of times in how we communicate and collaborate within those planning meetings. So there's opportunity for better activities and better planning to happen. And a third major problem within software, as with any other line of business, are deadlines. Sometimes we can make up our own deadlines, but other times we don't have that power. And a lot of times the deadline is get this done ASAP. The problem with an agile sprint having deadlines is that the deadlines are time boxed. At the end of every sprint, our goal is to ship an iterative value product, right? That could be a new feature or a new thing added on, whatever that might be. And the idea of time boxing, usually to 2 to 3 week sprints, is that we as a team can accomplish something and ship it and deliver it iteratively within that time. But truth be told, 2 weeks is not a long time to get something big done. And when you have the full pipeline of development going, from grooming and refinement to planning to development, testing, and then test automation, your runway is very, very short. And what I have found a lot of times is that teams struggle to develop the thing in 2 weeks, and the testing effort gets abbreviated. And sometimes the test automation doesn't even happen. It's very common for teams to either skip test automation altogether because they can't get it done in time, or to do it in an N+1 sprint or the next sprint, which is not really keeping with the agile philosophy of getting things done and the definition of done. So it's very, very hard to get all of these things done from communication down to delivery within these time boxes. So how can we solve these problems? We know they're real, we know they're there. One way is that if we can bring people together to focus on behaviors and give them good practices around cultivating those behaviors, then we can knock out these 3 problems pretty easily. And that is the crux of behavior-driven development. So what do I mean when I say behavior? If you look at the dictionary, the word behavior is defined as the way in which one acts or conducts oneself. When we apply that to software, a behavior is essentially how a feature operates. If we want to scrutinize that definition a little bit more, we could call it a feature function. A behavior is really defined as a scenario of inputs, actions, and outcomes for a specific software feature that we want to develop. It is a unit of product functionality. And when we look at software products, a product can exhibit countless behaviors. So let's look at some examples of what behaviors could be for different kinds of products. When we look at websites, these are very visual, very interactive things. And so behaviors could be things like logging in or logging out of the website, navigating through pages, submitting forms. You could extend this even further. Search engines, searching for phrases. Social media, liking a post or making a tweet. If we drop down to the service level, we can also look at behaviors there, such as making successful calls, including state change in the system, or receiving expected errors. We can also apply this thought of behaviors to anything in real life to kind of abstract it. Things like adding items to a shopping cart, paying for those items at checkout, or if you're a panda like me, eating bamboo. These are all examples of what behaviors could be. When we look at individual behaviors, this helps us avoid the problem of unnecessary complication. As we said before, software products, especially mature ones, can have countless behaviors, innumerable behaviors. And the question is, well, how do I start? What do I know what to look for? And how do I define these? I always recommend separate individual behaviors, because that way you will be able to look at things independently in bite-sized pieces and see how they can be composed together. For example, if I were going to go to an online store and try to shop for shoes, there's a couple ways I could proceed. One behavior could be searching for shoes from the store's homepage. If I go to shoestore.com and I go to their search bar and enter in like red pumps or Converse All-Stars or something, right? That's one way that I could find shoes. Another way I could find shoes would be if I already had bookmarked a direct URL to a search results list, right? Those are two separate behaviors of the website, either manually entering the search or going to a direct link. But both of those behaviors will ultimately send me to one place, which is the search results page. And from the search results page, there could be more behaviors that I could do, such as selecting links on that search results page to see the item in its full specification, or maybe clicking an image link to see a picture of the item. Separating each of these behaviors lets me look at each thing independently and do each thing well. And then to be able to compose behaviors together to provide the full value of the software product. And that is where behavior-driven development comes in. We know that we should be focused on behaviors when developing software because behaviors provide value to our users. Behavior-driven development could be defined simply as the software process that puts behaviors first because our users put behavior first. Now, there are many parts to the behavior-driven development process. I like to think of BDD as an amalgamation of helpful pragmatic practices rather than a full overhaul of an existing software system or software development process. And so these here are 4 parts of the BDD process that we'll cover today. 3 Amigos meetings for bringing people together. Example mapping as an activity to truly learn and plan stories. Specification by example for defining what the behaviors are. And then behavior implementation, implementing both the product and the test code. So as I said, we will go through each of these 4 processes in detail as part of this talk. And at the end of every segment, we'll pause and open up for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to start typing them in, and then at the checkpoint, we'll go and answer a few of them. And then also we'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of this webinar. Now, like I said before, try to think of BDD as a complement to your existing software practices and not an overhaul. I like to think of BDD as a refinement of Agile and as an evolution of test-driven development. These practices that we'll cover today can easily fold into any existing process to make things better in order to solve the problems that we've already discussed. So let's start off talking about 3 Amigos meetings. Who are the 3 Amigos? You may have heard this phrase before. The 3 Amigos refer to the 3 primary roles on a software development team. Those 3 roles being the business role, the development role, and the testing role. Now, there could be multiple people in each role on the team. I'm not saying each team has to have one of each. And they may go by different names. Testing could be called a QA analyst or a QE engineer, or the business person could be a business analyst or a product owner. But at its core, these are the 3 primary roles who come together to help develop software. And every one of these roles, in one way or another, works on behaviors, whether or not they are testing or developing or coming up with the requirements. They all simply work on these behaviors in different ways because they're adding the value of their role to the development of that behavior. The first Amigo of the 3 is the business role. As I said, these can sometimes be called business analysts or product owners. And the business role provides what problem must be solved. A lot of times, these are the customer-facing type people. They go out, they communicate with customers, find out what they need, find out what's working for them, find out what's not working for them. And the business role then originates the tickets in the backlog, so to speak. They're the ones who first formulate what the stories should be, even if only in rough draft form. Now, the business folks, they are oftentimes non-technical. Sometimes they may have a programming or developer background, and of course they'll have some connection to the tech world. But the business role is often not the one who's going to be implementing it. They're the ones who are focused on the business side of things. What's going to bring value to the customer, or what's going to bring value to this business for the customer. And so, like I said, they're the first Amigo. They're kind of the origination of the work to be done. The second Amigo in the trio is the development role. We oftentimes call these people developers or engineers, and it's the development role that provides how the solution will be implemented. Developers will build and maintain the software code for the behaviors being developed. They may or may not communicate with customers depending on how the company's culture is, but the developers must be deeply technical. Right? These are the guys who are going to be in code day in and day out. They're the ones who are writing the features, testing locally on their machine before they deploy, maybe writing some unit tests to go along with that. And they also contribute to the planning process as well, along with the business role. And the third Amigo, as we said, will be the testing role. They could be called testers or QAs or SDETs. Their key responsibility is to verify that the behaviors being delivered work correctly. And as part of that, they do a lot of testing. They try to find any defects before they get discovered by a user and hopefully then fixed. And really, the testing role is meant to be the advocate for the user, right? It shouldn't be just as simple as I followed a test procedure and I got a green or a red result. It should be, hey, is this really going to help them? Are there going to be other problems here that maybe we didn't think about? And so likewise, it's just as important for the tester to be involved in the planning of the work. And testers will often have varying degrees of technical depth. Some testers are purely manual testers, and they know the systems really, really well, and they can really, truly be that advocate for the user. And other testers tend to be more oriented towards automation. They may be developers at heart that are just making the tools and the tests and the scripts to really develop a full safety net and a continuous integration system with test automation. All of those kinds of folks fall under that testing role. So, pardon me. So we know that with BDD, we need to have inter-role collaboration on our behaviors, right? We can't have a game of telephone where the product owner says one thing and the developer interprets it to be another thing. And the tester sees it a third way, tells the developer they did their thing wrong, developer disagrees, goes back to the product owner, and product owner says, you are both wrong. We need to have a time for all three amigos to come together and get on the same page. And that's the purpose of the three amigos meetings. Three amigos meetings can be part of grooming, they can be part of planning, they could be a collaborative open space that is just a drop-in time for people to come by, or they could be their own dedicated ceremonies as part of your Agile Scrum workflow. What should you do in three amigos meetings? There's no hard and fast rule, but what matters is that you're setting aside time to be accountable and to be transparent with each other across role types. And so some activities I recommend for three amigos meetings would be things like doing example mapping together, which we'll talk about next, or writing Gherkin feature files together, or maybe if you have Gherkin feature files, reviewing them together to make sure that we're defining behavior well. It could be a time to discuss current and upcoming features. And it can also be the safe space to ask questions and to brainstorm together. Like I said, the key thing is that you bring the people together to have genuine time dedicated to collaboration. Now, I'm going to pause here before we continue. Are there any questions on anything so far?
Hey, Andy, that's great. We've got a couple questions already, but before we get to those, and while people are typing them out, what I'm going to do is do a couple of polls. So one of the things I always like to know is what people's current role is, and that will help us kind of tailor the presentation a little bit, but also help us understand maybe some of the questions we get. So if you guys will take just a moment here, it looks like everybody's already voting. We've got about 30%, quickly up to 45% of people voting. It looks like automation engineer is winning right now. So let's
Nice.
see how this happens. I'm gonna give it one more second here and close the poll. All right, and I'm gonna share these results real quick so that people can see them. So it looks like we have mostly test automation engineers or SDETs, although that's very close with testers. Quite a few managers and others. So that may help inform us as to some of the questions we get. I'm going to do one more poll as we're getting some more questions in. If I can hide results, and then let me share this. So prior to today, this question is prior to today, how much exposure did you have to behavior-driven development? And the options here are none, or I know the basic concepts. I've used it for some time on a daily or weekly basis. And then finally, I've used BDD extensively. So it looks like most people are going to be in that basic concepts group. We've just about got 70% voted here. So I'm going to just give it one more second to vote and close the poll, and I'm going to share those results. So it looks like most people are in that basic concepts group, Andy. So hopefully that can help inform you with regard to questions. So we can still see your screen, and I'm going to share some questions here.
Sure.
So the first question we had was from Anurag, and I'm sorry if I get your name wrong. I'm doing the best I can with some of these. What type of metrics can we use with BDD?
Ooh, that's a great question. There are so many metrics out there available. My stance on metrics is that all metrics are flawed, but some are helpful. And when it comes to BDD, most of the metrics that you're going to use are going to be pretty similar to other Agile metrics you already have. Things like velocity for your story points or code coverage for your unit tests. When it comes to the feature files in the Gherkin, as we'll come to in just a moment, some other metrics I like to add on would be, especially for teams just starting their BDD journey, would be like the percentage of tests per sprint that you end up automating. I always recommend to write Gherkin scenarios as part of your planning, no matter if you're going to automate them or not. But ideally, you want to use your scenarios as the starting point for your automation. So one thing you could do sprint by sprint to track is to say, hey, out of the 13 new Gherkin scenarios we wrote for this sprint, we were successful in automating, let's say, 9 of those within the sprint. And hopefully, as you mature and grow in your BDD process, you'll be able to see that percentage get higher and higher every single sprint. So that could be one metric. There's a bunch of other metrics we could talk about, but that's the big one that comes to mind.
That's great. And there was another question here along the same vein. Wilson, it sounds like he just answered your question. So maybe take another listen to the recording when you get a chance and see if he answered that. I want to add one more question here from Gabriel, and it says BDD can be applied to technical stories or for backend features. So they're asking, can BDD be applied to technical stories or backend features?
Yes. The answer is emphatically yes. My line of thinking is if you can describe it, then you can do it, right? Most examples we see within the BDD space are kind of front-end user-facing type behaviors, but that doesn't mean behaviors don't exist in, say, the back-end or the service layer or in some business layer. So yes, absolutely. If you can describe the behaviors happening in those back layers, you can do BDD with them too. And since you can describe just about anything, you can do it.
That's great. We've got a bunch of others here, but we're going to hold on to them until later. So
Cool.
Thank you. This is great so far. Looking forward to learning more.
Cool. Alrighty, so let's continue. Let's move on to our second practice called example mapping. You may have heard of this before. What is example mapping? Example mapping is an activity for clarifying and confirming user story behaviors. Remember that second problem we talked about with problems in poor planning, where the meetings that we use for planning can be ineffective? Example mapping is a great practice to introduce into those planning sessions to make things more efficient, more clear, and better defined. I have found that example mapping is a great way to get a full team actually engaged in true planning and not simply guessing. So for example mapping, what do? We'll step through the steps in just a moment, but just note, to get started, you'll need some colored cards to visually map out the story. You can do this as part of your refinement or your planning meetings. And its purpose is to facilitate conversation that can be otherwise unproductive. So let's see how we do this. First of all, we start with the story. Pick a story from your backlog and write it on a yellow card. Story should be in that as a blank, I want a blank, so that blank format, or whatever format you found is useful to your team for the stories you write. Write that story on a card. We're going to focus on this story for this round of example mapping and put that at the top of the board. Next, what we do collaboratively as a team, we will write a rule for that story on a blue card. The rules should be things that the story must satisfy. So if I'm talking about a shopping cart, then some of the rules for the shopping cart could be that I need to be able to add items to the shopping cart or remove items from the shopping cart, or the cart needs to carry up to 20 items. We write each of these rules underneath the story card on a blue card, one rule per card. And ultimately, these rules will become our acceptance criteria. So take time to make sure that these are correct and thorough. Talk with them as you write them as a team. This is supposed to be a collaborative exercise. Third step is that for each rule, we will come up with concrete examples that illustrate the rule. And we will write each example on a green card beneath the blue cards. Oftentimes we'll find that for every blue rule card, we'll have 2 or 3 or 4 green example cards. And that's great. We want to make sure that we have at least one example for every rule. These concrete examples confirm that everyone is thinking about the behavior in the same way. Whereas the rules can be abstract and esoteric, examples are meant to be concrete. And that's really there to help eliminate that miscommunication or that misunderstanding that different people can have. That's why we write out these examples. Furthermore, these examples will become the starting points for our Gherkin scenarios, which we'll talk about in the next step of our process. So keep that in the back of your mind. There's a method to the madness for why these are green. Finally, as we go along, we may not know everything we need to know for a story, right? And that's okay. Part of example mapping's purpose is to be exploratory. We are learning a story together as a team. However, in times that there are questions that we can't answer during the example mapping session, we don't want to lose what those questions are. So what we'll do is we will write them down on red cards and we'll put them off to the side, right? That way the questions are captured without interrupting the example mapping process. And we can come back and revisit those red cards after we're done example mapping this story. So some logistics for how this goes down. As I said, we can do this during refining meetings or planning meetings, or we could even do it in the very early days of a sprint. But when we choose to do it, make sure that we focus on one story at a time, right? Don't get sidetracked on other things. And each story should take about 20 to 30 minutes to do the mapping. All 3 amigos should participate. And at the end of the example mapping session, make sure to assign an owner to each question card. Those questions, a lot of times, will either become follow-up 3 amigos meetings, or spikes, or even sometimes new stories on their own. And once we have these cards for the example mapping, as I said before, the rules become the acceptance criteria. The examples become the starting point for our Gherkin scenarios, which as well becomes the starting point for our testing. And so these are artifacts that are very valuable to our full development process. So I'm going to stop again here for more questions. Do we have any others?
Hey, Andy. Yeah, I think there are a few more. So I'm going to, as people are typing maybe about example mapping, I have a few that are left over from earlier, so I'm going to ask 1 or 2 of those.
Sure.
So one of the questions was, is it okay to use Gherkin for unit testing? And if so, how do you do it?
Okay, so real talk, Andy's opinion, no, I do not recommend Gherkin for unit testing. The reason why is because unit testing, according to how I understand unit testing, is meant to specifically test code, whereas Gherkin scenarios and feature testing are meant to test behaviors in a black box sense. So you can use Gherkin and a framework like Cucumber to do your unit testing, but I think that's a little bit of overkill. Where Gherkin and BDD and Cucumber-like frameworks really shine for testing is really at that black box feature level.
That's great. So here's a question from Manish. Manish says, does Jira support example mapping?
Ooh, that's a great question. Honestly, I'm not sure. I would hope that there's some sort of plugin out there, and if not, there probably ought to be. But I personally have not used Jira for the sake of example mapping.
That's great. And let's see. So one more here. It says, hey, Andy, I'm working in manual testing. Can we BDD in manual testing?
You dang right you can, absolutely. BDD brings two major benefits, collaboration and automation. And we'll talk more about benefits towards the end of our presentation. Even if you are purely doing manual testing, the collaboration aspect and the specification aspect of BDD are still going to bring significant value because you're going to be doing better planning. You're going to be doing better communication. And from the very start of the sprint, when you have those examples and you have those scenarios, you basically have your acceptance test cases. So you don't need to spend your sprint wondering, what do I need to test? You already have it, and you can be proactive in how you can test.
That's great. There are a bunch more questions here. We may get back to some of them later, but let's continue for now.
Sure, sounds good. Pardon me. Oh shoot, there was one more example mapping thing. That's okay. So let's talk one more thing about example mapping. So as we said before, every team member should thoroughly understand the story. Each of these cards will become a part of our process. And what we see from the visuals will help us learn about the story too. So for example, if we have a lot of rules or a lot of examples, then maybe the story is too big. Or if we don't have very many at all and we have a lot of questions, maybe the story isn't ready to be committed to yet. So keep those in mind as you proceed with example mapping. Now, example mapping will directly lead into the next practice, which is specification by example. And specification by example usually means Gherkin. What is specification by example? Well, once stories and their acceptance criteria are well defined, e.g., once we've done example mapping on a story, then we want to take those behaviors that we've identified and discovered and truly formalize them. That's what specification by example is. It is the practice of describing behaviors using some sort of spec language or business language with examples. Gherkin, being the cucumber language, the given, when, then, is one of the most common formats for specification by example. And as we said before, every single one of those green example cards from the example mapping exercise will be the starting point for specification by example. There's no mistake in why we call them quote unquote example cards. So here is an example Gherkin scenario for one of the examples from our shopping cart story. Gherkin is not truly a programming language, so don't feel scared. It's really a specification language, and most of it's written in plain English. The way most Gherkin-based frameworks will work is you have at the top of your file a feature section with a title. And the title I recommend to be your story title. I also like to put the story description here in the Gherkin because it really helps to orient what this feature should be doing. Under each feature section, you can have multiple scenario sections. And the scenarios are those concrete examples for the rules for the story. So here with this particular example, the scenario is add items to the shopping cart. We write our Gherkin scenarios in given, when, then format. If you've done unit testing before, you may be familiar with arrange, act, assert. Given, when, then is kind of like BDD's version of arrange, act, assert. So given the cart has 5 items, when 8 items are added to the cart, then the cart contains 13 items. These given, when, then steps are cool in that they frame our context for how we should be writing these behaviors. The givens always set up some sort of initial state or precondition. The when steps always take the actions for the interaction of the product under test. And the then steps are there to verify our outcomes. Each one of these lines is written in plain language, right? There are test automation frameworks that will link these to methods and functions that we can execute. But apart from all that, What we have here is a nice, concise definition of this particular behavior example. So, why do we use examples? Examples are very important, right? In the previous Gherkin scenario, we gave hard numbers such as 5s and 8s and 13s, right? We didn't just say abstractly, I have A and I add B and I get A plus B. We use examples because real world examples are more understandable than abstractions. Examples help us to understand what's going on. Examples help us to communicate better, and examples get us all on the same page. I'm going to drive this home with a point from outside of the software domain. We all know art and we all know paintings, but if I were to ask you what, say, Henry Matisse's artwork looks like, without these pictures, how would I describe it? I could say things like they have bold color, strong strokes, lots of blues and reds. They're kind of an extension of Impressionism, Fauvism, right? All those words would fall kind of meaningless without the examples of some of his actual paintings, like here, the woman in the hat, or the open window, or the portrait of Madame Matisse. When I say things like big, bold color with thick strokes, and you see the examples of it, you really, really, really understand it and you can see it. And we all know now what Henry Matisse's artwork looks like, to the point where if we go to a museum, we could probably pick out others, or rather even some similar artists as well. So before we continue, I'll stop again for questions.
Hey, Andy. So let me pull up the questions here. Quite a few left over. So let's see. So one person asked, Ray asked, what's the difference between gherkin and cucumber?
Ooh, excellent question. So Gherkin is the given when then specification language. This is an example of Gherkin here. Cucumber is a test automation framework that will take Gherkin files, which we call feature files, and glue them to some sort of code, whether it's Java, C# or Python or JavaScript, whatever. Cucumber is a framework that will take Gherkin files, glue them to code for the sake of executing these Gherkin scenarios as test cases. And we're going to see that in our next process step.
That's great. Someone also mentioned what's the difference between SpecFlow and Cucumber, and that's just, you can think of Cucumber in C# as SpecFlow. SpecFlow is one implementation of C# Cucumber.
Correct.
A couple other questions here. So one, I thought this was really interesting from Candace, and this is a little bit of a question from earlier, but still a very good one. Taking 20 to 30 minutes to begin refinement each story will cause a tremendous increase in time it typically takes us to refine a story. Would you spend this amount of time on every story?
Great question. I would say if you're just getting started, try 1 or 2 stories. Don't put the entire weight of your sprint planning and your backlog on a new process without taking it for a test drive. And what I'll also say is that if you take the time to plan the story well early on and shifting left and doing it at planning time, most likely your team will see the benefits pay off long term, later in the sprint, later in your epics, and later in your releases. Because ultimately, you're going to be wasting less time on confusion and not having testing ready and having bugs happen that you need to go fix, because you've invested the time earlier in high quality, making sure those things don't happen.
That's great. You want one more?
We'll take one more.
Okay. Last one for this question period. So what are step definitions in Cucumber?
Great question. Step definitions are the methods that will implement each one of those individual Gherkin steps. And that's a great segue into practice number 4 here, behavior implementation. Cool. So shall we continue?
Sounds good.
Awesome. Let's talk about behavior implementation. How are behaviors implemented? Pardon me. A team knows the behaviors to develop once they are defined using those Gherkin scenarios. That's why we want to shift left and do all that extra planning and example mapping early on in the sprint. Once we have the example mapping done and we have those Gherkin behavior scenarios defined, developers can implement what those features are. And at the same time, testers can implement the test automation for those behaviors. If teams are really leading edge, they can even do TDD style testing, where they run their Gherkin style tests first and let them fail until the features are implemented correctly. When it comes to BDD test automation, those behavior specs, those Gherkin scenarios, effectively are test cases. And I think this is where a lot of those questions were coming into. When we use a BDD test framework, whether it's Cucumber, SpecFlow, Behave, PyTest BDD, you name it, what you do is you have the scenario to start with, and each one of those given, when, then lines will be its own step. So in our BDD framework, in the C# and the Java and the Python, we will write a method or a function that will execute each one of those unique steps. The BDD framework, when it goes to run those specs, will take every single given, when, or then, find what the matching method or function is in the test automation code base, usually using some sort of string matching or regular expression matching, and effectively glue that method to the step. And thus, your Gherkin scenarios effectively become test scripts. BDD frameworks just run Gherkin feature files like they're test scripts. And what's really nice about that too, and one of the reasons I love BDD test frameworks, is that makes it very easy to reuse common steps for other scenarios. If I can ask you a question, if you do web testing, how many times do you have to log into the web app, right? How many times do you need to, I don't know, do the same kind of search or go down the same sort of navigation path or load the same page? Test automation has a lot of those kinds of redundant steps. So rather than duplicate the code to do them, we have these steps that can be shared and reused very, very easily. There are a number of BDD frameworks out there. I think one of the questions was, what's the difference between like SpecFlow and Cucumber? When it comes to Gherkin-based BDD frameworks, they're all going to be Cucumber-like in the sense that they're all going to have the same type of format for Gherkin, maybe a few different little variations here and there. So I always recommend read the docs on whatever framework you're using. But some of the popular ones out there would be Cucumber, Cucumber JVM, Serenity BDD, JBehave, Jasmine or Mocha, C#, I do that every day. SpecFlow, I love SpecFlow. I think it's great. In Python, you can also do like PyTest BDD or Behave or Radish. So there's tons of frameworks out there. I would say pick the one that meets your needs and then read the documentation to see what the little idiosyncratic differences are between them. So I'll pause one more time for questions here before the end, before we tie everything together. What other questions do we have?
Hey, I think we're running low on time. So I think we should skip the questions. We've got a list of them here. If you're open to it,
Okay.
I'm putting you on the spot. I'll send the questions to you afterwards. And if you'd like to respond to some of them, you're welcome to.
Sure, I can do that. Totally
Okay,
cool.
perfect. That's what we'll do.
Yeah, awesome. So then let's forward and tie it all together. So as I said at the beginning of this webinar, I really like to pitch BDD as a set of pragmatic practices to help solve real-world problems with software development. And so every single one of these practices that we've looked at, solves one of the major problems we looked at the beginning. 3 Amigos meetings directly address how to solve problems with miscommunication by bringing people together in a safe space to collaborate. Example mapping is a way that we can help to improve any poor planning that goes on. And specification by example and behavior implementation really help us to meet our in-sprint deadlines, because when we've shifted left and we know everything we have to do from the beginning of a sprint, we can really expedite both our development as well as our test automation, such that by the time the sprint is over, we'll have a better chance of actually getting the work done and having automated tests for it, or as well, getting the manual testing done. And these practices will bring us many benefits. The big 2 benefits for BDD, always preached, are better collaboration and better test automation. And I think we've covered those pretty well with the practices that we've already looked at. Some other benefits that you might also get from doing these BDD practices, one of which is efficiency, right? We know that we have to do all these things like planning and developing and testing and automating, right? BDD as a process provides a paradigm and a framework for really getting all these things done and for making sure that they benefit from each other. That's where a lot of that efficiency comes in, right? When we define what our behaviors are in Gherkin, we already know what our test cases are, and we've already partially automated the test. And if I can take this a step further, if we already have the steps, boom, then the test automation is kind of done. So that's where BDD can really make our processes more efficient. We also get better traceability, right? Because we have a line and artifacts directly from I have an idea to a story to here's the package with the developed feature and its automated tests with a whole bunch of example mapping cards and Gherkin scenarios in between, right? We can see exactly how we got from idea to delivery. And finally, we also get accountability, right? Everyone on the team is going to participate. And with practices like example mapping, there's no time for people just to kind of space out on their laptops in meetings, right? Everybody's in it and everybody can contribute and everyone can add value. So that's very, very helpful as well. So that's basically the end of my spiel on behavior-driven development for today. I could talk literally all day long, but in the best interest of everybody's time, here's some additional resources I recommend. So there's a couple good websites out there. Mine, for example, Automation Panda. I've got a lot of information on BDD and testing and automation and all sorts of stuff. Other good websites are the Cucumber website, as well as Spec Solutions. Lots of good information and resources there. And if you want to read some books to learn more about BDD, I can recommend BDD in Action by John Ferguson Smart, as well as the Cucumber book, the classic, by Matt Wine and Aslak Helsoy. So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Boom.
Thank you so much, Andy. This is great. Thank you so much. So we all appreciate it. As we're closing up here, we want to make sure we know who gets this Amazon gift card. I'm going to launch one more poll. I got several emails as we were going through this of people who want to talk about training on BDD. And so here's one way that if you would like to opt into that, if you'd like to talk to us a little bit more about training in BDD and how you can implement it at your company, give us a yell here, just click yes, and we'll reach out to you. I'm going to close this up here in just a second. Looks like people are still active on it, so I don't want to miss people who are interested. And you can always contact us through the website, beaufortfairmont.com. You can get us at our phone number, which has been on all of the slides for this. Lots of different ways to connect to us. And I'm going to switch over to myself as the presenter, if I can find out how to do this. For some reason, it pulls up everyone. There we go. Okay. And then I want to show a screen. Let's see if we can get the right screen there. Okay. So I want to know, like everybody else, who is going to win? Let's see if the rim shot works here. Perfect. And the winner is Gabriel A. Gabriel A. I appreciate your participation today. You have won the $50 gift card. Keep in mind, folks, if you want to talk about test automation, give us a call, 984-244-2313. And anytime I'm open to having a conversation about test automation, about your challenges with test automation, where your team is, whether or not BDD is the right choice for you, challenges in implementing BDD, and many, many other ideas as well. So always open to an hour, free hour-long call. And if it goes farther than that, we'll figure out what to do. But my goal is to make a positive impact on the world through test automation. And if we can do that with you in an hour, that's fine. If we need to do more work, that's fine too. So give us a call today or set up a time with me to talk. And I really appreciate everybody being here. Congratulations again to Gabriel. You'll be getting an email from me within the next 24 hours. A lot of people asked if this is recorded. It will be recorded. It is being recorded, and that will be available at the very same link you got here with. You'll just have to go through the registration page again, unfortunately, and then you'll be able to view the recording. You will also receive an email in the next 24 to 48 hours with the recording attached or in a link from there. So that's available, and you can always find all of our great webinars at beaufortfairmont.com/webinars, including this one. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.